Well, for our last panel, welcome back. For our last panel of the afternoon before our closing keynote, or our evening keynote, last panel on civic education and American universities. And the leadership transition here at SCETL with an new incoming director is a good moment to reflect on the impact that SCETL has had on a movement to create centers at universities across the United States. There have been a number of initiatives at varying stages of development to establish programs in civic education at major public universities. And today we have a panel to discuss that. And chairing that panel is Richard Avramenko is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's been since 2005, and he will be joining us as our new director, our second director in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Professor Avramenko is also the editor-in-chief of the Political Science Reviewer and director of the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy. He's the author of Courage, The Politics of Life and Limb, published in 2011, and more recently, Aristocratic Souls in Democratic Times, among other works. And so I hand it over to Professor Avramenko.
Well, thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for letting me come. The purpose of this panel is to explore the state of civic education in American universities. In the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University, it opened in 2017 to address the paucity of civic education at American institutions of higher education, and it has proved to be a model for new programs around the country. New civics institutes have been created or are being created in Tennessee, Texas, North Carolina, Florida, Utah, and Ohio. Notably, for me at least, one is not being created in Wisconsin. Joining us on this panel are leaders in this movement who will provide an assessment of their success and impact. Our first speaker will be Lee J. Strang. Professor Strang is the John W. Stoepler Professor of Law and Values at the University of Toledo, where he's also the director of the new Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. A graduate of University of Iowa, Professor Strang holds an LLM from Harvard Law School. He's been a visiting scholar at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution and a visiting fellow at the James Madison program at Princeton. In 2016, he was appointed to the Ohio Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and has been the chair of that since 2022. It sounds like a lot of work. Professor Strang has received the University of Toledo's Outstanding Faculty Research and Scholarship Award, the University of Toledo's Inclusive Excellence Award, and the 2021 U Toledo Creative and Scholarly Activity Award. He was named to the Advisory Council of the Center for Originalism and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition, which includes Justice Alito and scholars from Oxford and Notre Dame. In 2023, Professor Strang was named the inaugural director of the Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. Our second speaker will be Dr. Jenna Storey. Dr. Storey is a senior fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Division of the American Enterprise Institute. She's also a research fellow at the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas. Before moving to AEI, Dr. Storey was an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Furman University, where she also served as the executive director of Furman's Tocqueville program. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and First Things. Dr. Storey is the co-author with her husband Ben of Why We Are Restless on the Modern Quest for Contentment, and they are currently working on a second book with Princeton entitled The Art of Choosing, which, if it's anything like their last book, we should artfully choose to read it. Our third speaker will be Professor William Inboden. Professor Inboden received his PhD and MA degrees in history from Yale and his AB in history from Stanford. He's now professor and director of the Alexander Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. He's the Peterson Senior Fellow with the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Prior to his move to Gainesville, he was the executive director and William Powers Jr. Chair at the Clements Center for National Security and associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and his commentary has appeared in many outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, National Review, NPR, CNN, and BBC. Professor Inboden is the author or co-editor of 4 books, and his most recent book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, has received many national awards. Welcome to all 3 of you, and let us get started with Professor Strang.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you to the entire SCETL team for organizing this conference and this panel. As someone who's been in the trenches, engaged in the work of rebuilding civic thought in the United States, I've been looking forward to this conversation for months. The title of my remarks this afternoon is really a question: is civic thought a master discipline for our pluralistic republic? I argue that the proposal put forward by Ben and Jenna Storey, and this is the proposal, many of you have read it, this important white paper could be a proposal to replicate the role that philosophy played in 13th century universities, which is, first, to employ the internal perspective of citizens of our republic, second, to leverage our political community's epistemic authorities, in order to, third, structure the university's curriculum with the goal to cultivate the goods of our republic in love of those goods. My claim, in essence, is that the proposal is to do for the American university what philosophy did for the medieval university, consistent with the characteristics of our political community. My remarks summarize some of my thoughts on the philosophical claims, premises, and implications of the Storey's proposal for American universities. And my interest in the Storey's proposal is the product of one of the veins of my scholarship, which is a history of Catholic higher education in the United States. And that was a system of higher education that continued at least until the mid-20th century to cultivate a distance from the modern research university, although most of those universities have since come on board with the modern research university. And of course, it's also part of my own interest and involvement in advancing civic thought centers that are opening in Ohio. And one of the questions that these centers have, including my own, is whether they are going to offer a distinct discipline. There are many important practical considerations that bear on this proposal that aren't the focus of my remarks. Happy to talk about them in our questions and comment period. We've got 15 minutes, so a lot of things I can't say. Looking forward to your questions. So I'm going to make 3 quick moves. First, I'm going to briefly describe the evolution of the university from a place where scholars pursued a theologically oriented and sociologically accepted big T truth to today's research universities, which are places of multiple and mutually independent epistemic authorities, the disciplines. Second, I argue that the Storey's proposal is possibly an attempt to provide an epistemic authority for today's American universities, because civic thought has the capability and perhaps the ambition of organizing the various disciplines in the same way that philosophy organized the medieval university's curriculum. Third, I describe 5 potential implications if my comparison is accurate. My first move is to describe very briefly the evolution of universities, and the subtitle is From a Master Discipline to Multiple Disciplines. Western universities evolved from their initial vision of participants together pursuing a theologically informed truth to modern universities as places of multiple and mutually independent sources of truth. This is a deep and complicated story, so this is, of course, a very brief summary. Today's university's origins lie in the High Middle Ages. This was a period of tremendous intellectual ferment. Beginning in the 12th century, the West recovered access to many ancient writings, including in particular Aristotle's writings, which had recently been translated into Latin. And Aristotle's writing and ideas, those both sympathetic to and in tension with Christianity, caused tremendous intellectual excitement. And the university was the location where a robust debate within this ferment as different schools of philosophical thought pursued together big T truth. The medieval university's debate was bounded in 2 key ways. First, the medieval university's curricular structure reflected the broader culture's answers to common questions. Europeans in the Middle Ages shared essentially the same answers to the most important questions of life. Is there a God? What is his relationship to me? What's my purpose? How should I treat others? And the answers were then centered around consensus points at the universities, and debate participants grounded their claims on these answers to these common questions. Second, and relatedly, medieval university debate participants employed a series of conventional authorities, including theological, philosophical, legal, and other authorities. A key text, of course, in this area was the Bible, and any claim, for example, made participants in the medieval university debates had to be consistent with it. As a result, a common assumptions and widely shared authorities, in medieval universities there was robust debate within the frame of a generally recognized truth and process to evaluate truth claims. As summarized by Alistair McIntyre, quote, It was because of both audience and lecturers accepted standards of truth and rationality, independent of either, that each could summon the other to test any particular thesis in the form of disputation, the intellectual equivalent of trial by ordeal. So while there were disagreements and debates during this period, it was not radical. It did not go to the foundational assumptions and key authorities employed by the debate participants. Perhaps counterintuitively, in a culture as religiously homogeneous and whose central authorities were the Bible and St. Augustine's philosophy and not theology was the architectonic discipline, the master science that organized the other disciplines. But philosophy's role did not displace theology. Instead, it gave pride of place to theology because of theology's role as the key science, providing the clearest and most sure answer to important questions. The contemporary university, however, is a place of multiple, mutually independent sources of truth. Today's American university, for good or ill, is not Thomas Aquinas's, and for a host of reasons, lots of reasons. Two that I would suggest are deep religious pluralism that then deepened into other forms of pluralism, and second, the rise of natural sciences that for the first time made it possible to provide explanations other than religious explanations for many of the important phenomena of the world, including the existence of human beings. Our situation today is one of deep pluralism and for the foreseeable future. In this environment, the modern university took shape. The university cannot organize itself around one particular discipline's claims to authoritative access to the truth because that's not a generally recognized phenomenon sociologically. Instead, American universities today use the specific disciplines, utilizing the discipline's own specific standards internal to them to identify truth within that. In other words, modern universities still produce and curate truth, but they do so without a master discipline that orders and structures their truth claims. And this facet of American universities, which I think was mentioned earlier today, is an outgrowth of 19th century German conceptions of the university. As articulated by William von Humboldt, the 18th century architect of the Prussian university system, the purpose of universities was to discover the truth, and the mechanisms to do so was research conducted in the various disciplines. What von Humboldt labeled Wissenschaft is, quote, the objective and scholarly knowledge about the world of nature and of human affairs. Only within and according to each discipline's standards of rationality can truth claims be epistemically warranted. This conception of the modern university was brought to the United States in the late 19th century by many people, including, among others, the brilliant and long-serving president of Harvard, Charles Eliot. In 1869, at the ripe old age of 35, chemistry professor Eliot was elected to lead and transform Harvard, and it was based on his publications in The Atlantic about what his program was going to be. Eliot did indeed transform Harvard. In his over 40 years of tenure, Eliot abolished Harvard's long-standing curriculum rooted in classical languages, history, philosophy, and theology, and replaced it with a system of elective curricular options. In his inaugural address, Eliot outlined his vision. He said, quote, when the revelation of a student's own peculiar taste and capacity comes to a young man, let him reverently give it welcome, thank God, and take courage. But the state in its variety, not uniformity of intellectual product, which is needful. So what Eliot was saying was twofold. First, each student can self-discover and self-actualize his or her own unique talents because of the elective system. Second, the variety of disciplines will provide pragmatic enrichment to our political community through the creation of epistemically warranted knowledge. Unlike the medieval university, according to Eliot, the modern university does not purport to answer the most important questions of life, nor does it have a reservoir of shared epistemic authorities from which it can structure the pursuit of truth. As described by McIntyre, quote, the university is a place where it is nobody's responsibility to relate what is learned and taught in one discipline to what is learned and taught in another. My second move this afternoon is to ask, can civic thought be the master discipline for universities in our pluralistic republic? The Storey's proposal may have the capacity and possibly even the aspiration to be a master discipline of universities in our republic. The key move of the proposal, as I see it, is to employ the internal perspective of a citizen, leverage the common authorities of our political community, structure the university's curricula in order to cultivate love of the goods in our republic. There are 4 parts to this. First, civic thought addresses the most important questions in our republic because it takes the internal perspective, the perspective of the citizen in our pluralistic republic. As summarized by the Storeys, quote, civic thought rejects unencumbered individuals, and, quote, will begin with the effort to understand the political and social context in which students are already implicated. Civic thought identifies the most important questions faced by citizens in our republic, and in particular, as they put it, How shall I shoulder my share of the responsibility for our common political community? And uses the sociologically accepted authorities in our republic to answer that question. This is something like what the medieval university did. Second, civic thought is premised on sociologically accepted authorities in our pluralistic republic. Civic thought takes as a given a set of authorities widely recognized. The stories talk about a number of them in their paper, but you can imagine others, including the Declaration, the Constitution, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, great thinkers, great books of the Western tradition, and most importantly for our purposes today, the knowledge provided by the existing specialized disciplines, especially history, economics, philosophy, literature, and law. Third, civic thought has the capacity to organize the modern university's curriculum. Civic thought is focused on, quote, the whole of our common life, and the university curriculum can be structured to provide the resources needed by citizens that bear on their responsibility. So again, like the medieval university whose curriculum was ordered by the discipline of philosophy. Fourth, civic thought is aimed at and can aim universities towards the goods of our republic. The United States has preserved, cultivated, and created many goods, and love of these goods is a basis for action. Civic thought encompasses a number of these goods, including the republic itself, fellow citizens, and importantly, the existing university disciplines. So unlike the medieval university, which cultivated love of God, the civic thought doesn't cultivate the love of God, at least not formally, but does cultivate the love of the genuine goods of our republic. I think it's an open question whether the proposal has the ambition of being our university's master discipline. Certainly on the face of the proposal, the stories do not push this ambition, and at times they even disclaim such an ambition. Quote, to be sure, universities and colleges exist to provide a home for many kinds of intellectual activity, many kinds which go beyond even the highest level preparation for citizenship. But there are other claims and other premises that the stories employ that suggest the possibility of it becoming a master discipline. Let me make my third move, which are the implications if my claim is true. If it's the case that civic thought has the capacity and the ambition to be the master discipline of universities in our republic, I'll note 5, and the 5th is the most important. First, if and to the extent that civic thought is in fact based on sociologically accepted authorities in our pluralistic republic, then it has a sound chance of success. If in fact the authorities employed by civic thought are widely accepted, to that extent in principle, they should be accepted by most Americans. Second, civic thought reorients universities towards the love of the good, which will also be attractive to many people. The medieval university was oriented towards the love of a good. Now civic thought is not oriented towards that same good, but it can be attractive to young people who are oriented to the true goods that our republic offers. Third, and importantly, existing specialized disciplines don't go away. Their causes of their existence, the deep pluralism and their pragmatic effectiveness, continues, and civic thought would continue to utilize the value brought about by those disciplines. Fourth, the proposal becomes more dangerous if and to the extent civic thought has the aspirations of being a master discipline and is therefore more likely to arouse opposition from supporters of the status quo. However, as I argued, the proposal does not purport to disrupt the existing disciplines. Instead, it proposes to employ their knowledge they produce within its discipline to achieve its goals. Fifth, and the last implication that I'll note, if civic thought, as a proposal, it may be in deep tension with how at least some of the disciplines have conceptualized and reconceptualized themselves. In the past few decades, there have been new disciplines created. I have in mind disciplines including the identity program studies. Some of the existing disciplines have reconceptualized themselves. So my understanding is that sociology, not a sociologist, has reconceptualized its professional norms and has taken on board an explicit norm of advocating for what they perceive as subordinated minority groups. And there continue to be debates within existing disciplines, such as classics, and that to the extent that these disciplines move themselves away from the 19th century conception of knowledge production into something that's explicitly ideological, then it seems like civic thought would have a challenge in being able to utilize and to deal with them. So in closing, let me be clear that I'm not advocating that civic thought becomes the master discipline of universities in our republic. The goal of my remarks, rather, is to suggest that it may have the capacity and potentially the ambition to bring about a unity to our American universities that they have not seen since Charles Eliot and others transformed American education in the late 19th century. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lee, for that, that unexpected and very thoughtful analysis of a paper that my husband and I wrote in December on trying to sketch the outlines of a potentially new discipline of civic thought. You've said a lot that I'm thinking about, and I think I'll leave most of my remarks for the question period and beyond that. My plan now was to present some version of that article, starting with the observation, well, not assuming that everyone's read it, and starting with the observation that it's a very propitious moment, as Rick mentioned, because SCETL is not going to be the only one of its kind, that it's a model that many are interested in taking up and developing, and then posing the question, what exactly should we understand it to be a model of? And the way I'm thinking about it is that it's a new kind of university-level civic education that is different from the ways that our country has typically offered civic education in the universities in the past. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not that we just haven't been doing civic education in the universities, we've been doing it in different ways. In the early 19th century, it was commonly said to be primarily delivered through the moral philosophy capstone course offered by college presidents. Later in that century, universities claimed to be educating their students civically when they were teaching young people to think like scientists about social problems. After World War I and again after World War II, universities were designing general education programs that were intended to support fragile free societies by instilling attitudes and understandings, quote, that form the essence of good citizenship. And in the last few decades, civic education in the university has largely become a matter of service learning, focused on community engagement. Ronald Daniels, the president of Johns Hopkins University, tells this history in his book, What Universities Owe Democracy, as part of an argument that culminates in his claim that service learning, while valuable in his view, is not adequate to civic education because it's not adequate for the intellectual preparation for a political life. So now at Hopkins, students will soon take a course to fulfill a democracy requirement, and a couple other universities, notably Stanford, are requiring their students to do that kind of thing. But it strikes me that SCETL and other schools like it are a far more ambitious innovation in this direction. That is a far more ambitious attempt to offer an intellectual preparation for political life. For by being schools, they essentially make the claim that the study of civics is a worthy focus for an entire undergraduate education and perhaps even a graduate education. And furthermore, they imply that studying civics requires the development of new academic units because civics isn't being done and perhaps cannot be done by any of the departments and disciplines currently found in the university. So the questions for my paper are, what might the distinctive intellectual mission of a university-level civic education be? Are these schools actually launching something like a new discipline, a particular way of training the mind to see certain truths, gain deeper understandings, and attain new insights? Or are they properly interdisciplinary? And if so, what is the principle of organization and of limitation? Will they indeed together constitute a distinctive new intellectual enterprise? And will it acquire the apparatus of such a thing, such as degrees that confer a possibility of teaching in such programs, particular journals, associations, and prizes? If they do this, can they serve as a model for private universities to take up something similar, therefore becoming part of a larger ecosystem? Or will they each go their own way? Structurally, these schools are set up to endure, but to maintain their basic shape and purpose after the energy and insight of the founding generation is forgotten, it strikes me that we should be thinking now about whether and how the schools serve an intellectual mission that is distinctive from everything else being offered. So as a contribution to this ongoing discussion, I'm going to make some remarks about the potential scope and distinctive approach of a program of study we've called civic thought. The name, of course, has been extracted from the longer name of the SCETL school at ASU. And it's also meant to signal that civics is something appropriate to study in the university. It's not something we're doing here only because it gets neglected in K-12. It's not remedial. And finally, the name is meant to sound novel, a little bit strange, to prompt the question, what is civic thought anyway? So my sketch of the outlines of civic thought will proceed from a consideration of the intellectual demands of citizenship. First, what is the scope of things a citizen needs to know? A competent citizen needs to know the structures of governance, federal and state, within which he will operate. This basic information about how things work in our political system is what Daniel Allen nicely calls the owner's manual of America. But to appreciate this owner's manual, or to use it well, the scope of things a citizen would ideally investigate is much broader. For it's hard to understand our constitutional system without seeing it as one attempt of people to self-govern, attempts that have often dissolved into civil war or stiffened up into despotism. So the story of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, of medieval and modern Britain, a story which is related in a recent book by Josh Ober and Brooke Manville, a book called The Civic Bargain, could all rightly fall within the scope of civic thought. Some critics of offering civics courses in the university see them as, quote, devoid of rigor and intellectual content. But if we see American civics as not just some facts to get informed about, but a daring enterprise into which to be introduced, we may meet their objections. For the study of civics might rightly be structured around questions that have preoccupied the finest of minds, such as Madison's question: how can institutions empower a majority to rule while restraining it from tyrannizing over the majority? Or Tocqueville's question: how can a people who love equality also maintain their love of liberty? When the study of American civics is structured through such questions, one is prepared to see our institutions and practices as ingenious answers to intimidating questions. The study of those questions may deserve to be taken up not only by undergraduates, but also by PhDs. A citizen is not, however, fundamentally an expert in political systems, an observer of the variety of ways that people have chosen to govern themselves. They also participate in self-government, which means, among other things, they're implicated in making judgments in some way on all of the questions that a government considers. And at its various levels, American government touches on almost every dimension of human life. We have a Treasury Department, a State Department, a National Endowment for the Humanities. We have an EPA and an NSF. Experts serve in each of these agencies, of course, but citizens, through their elected officials, decide whether they should be funded and what activities are justly included in their mandate. It's therefore within the scope of civic thought to provide an introduction to the basic principles underlying these endeavors and to prepare citizens to ask intelligent questions of those who specialize in them. I think this is the case even if you don't like the fact that our federal government gets involved in so many areas of life. For protecting any given area of life from undue government interference requires understanding the nature of that activity, why it's worthy, and why it needs political freedom to flourish. To understand the limits of government, one also needs to understand what properly stands outside or above it. So as I've articulated it here, the scope of civic thought may seem impossibly broad, but I don't think it's broader than the actual range of demands we make on a self-governing people, nor is it broader than the questions and topics we often propose to examine in the course of a liberal education. And like a liberal education, civic thought aims to help human beings live up to a high ideal. That is, to live well as a free person, in this case, concentrating on becoming capable of thoughtful, collective self-governance. But especially as the range of topics that a citizen must consider is so dauntingly expansive, civic thought will not be adequately defined by its scope. It requires an approach that distinguishes it from other modes of inquiry that may be undertaken in fields touching on the topics mentioned above. That approach best takes its bearings from the question, what does it mean to think like a citizen? A good citizen, first of all, understands the proper work of politics. As the legal theorist Jeremy Waldron explains it, politics arises in circumstances when two conditions are found. One, there's something that must be done together. And two, there is disagreement about what it is that should be done. Citizens need to learn to think about proposed courses of action in a manner that takes into account different perspectives while striving to reach a judgment about what is best for the whole. This kind of work involves a different manner of intellectual preparation found in our universities today. Higher education focuses on the development of expertise. Expertise, of course, makes American universities the envy of the world. But the work of the expert is not aimed at making comprehensive judgments, as citizens are called upon to do. Citizens therefore need to learn to consult experts and assess what they offer, but they also need to understand that making a prudential judgment about the best course of action for a whole people can never be derived from the counsels of any particular specialty. Confusion about this point was widespread during the recent COVID pandemic, especially among the educated classes. Many in those classes looked to experts to solve the country's problems. But good political decisions cannot simply follow any particular science. For as Jen Frey nicely puts it, political judgment requires the intellectual virtue of being able to hold more than one good in one's mind at once. So while the epidemiologist can tell us how to minimize the spread of the disease, the citizen must weigh his counsel with that of the mental health expert, the economist, the educator, and so forth. Furthermore, the citizen must consult the experience of other citizens who live in different geographic, economic, and occupational situations, in an endeavor to grasp which of the proposed ways of responding to the challenge at hand is likely to nudge the country toward a condition in which more people are able to achieve the general good of living well. The approach of civic thought might therefore cultivate the perspective of a disciplined generalist, someone who strives to attain the intellectual capacity to sketch out a synoptic account of things while attending to a multiplicity of partial insights. That capacity can be trained by studying those authors who cut across the categories of contemporary specialties by transcending their distinctions, authors such as Plato or Goethe or Aristotle. Academics today are trained to look at parts of things in great detail. Disciplined generalists remind us that parts look differently depending on how one sees the whole. They show us the importance of offering a comprehensive sketch of the human situation while remaining aware of both the unavoidable incompleteness of such efforts and their necessity for orienting us in the world. The approach of civic thought also differs from another form of intellectual preparation the contemporary academy typically offers and promotes, that of critical thinking. This is often presented as a kind of common denominator of all the specialties, what any undergraduate can learn from them. Thinking critically does mean a variety of things in the contemporary university, including teaching young people to question their own assumptions or others' conclusions, or to evaluate sources to learn to separate solid reporting from fake news. These skills are useful components in developing the kind of thinking that citizens need to exercise, but are not adequate to fulfill the intellectual demands of citizenship. For the fundamental intellectual effort of the citizen is to learn to think responsibly and productively. And the role of civic thought is to prepare citizens for making thoughtful decisions about matters that call for common action. The approach of civic thought to the topics it considers is therefore not that of a disinterested spectator, a value-free scientist, or a social critic. Rather, it is that of one who understands himself as implicated, for better or worse, in the unfolding history of his political community. The distinctive disposition that civic thought might cultivate is well captured in a phrase of Hannah Arendt's from her essay, The Crisis of Education. Arendt argues there that the proper disposition of a teacher is the willingness to take joint responsibility for the world. Those suited to be teachers take ownership of the world as they have inherited it and present it as something that they have, for a brief moment, in common with the next generation. They refrain, she says, from indulging in a posture of estrangement, an attitude of unquenchable dissatisfaction and disgust with things as they are. Those engaged in civic thought should similarly be cultivating a disposition of willingness to take joint responsibility for their country. This willingness exemplifies what Tocqueville called reflective patriotism. Reflective patriotism is not just sentimental attachment to one's land, nor does it entail the view that one's country is objectively superior to all others. It is a reasoned acknowledgement and appreciation for the way in which one's life is intertwined with the history and fate of one's polity. It entails both a conservative respect for the past and a progress-oriented desire to respond to present injustices and inadequacies so that one's efforts become part of a better future. In closing, I just want to say that I think these new programs have been given a tremendous opportunity to develop a new model of a university-level civic education by the fact that several of them are designated as schools or even colleges. Ron Daniels remarks that it was disciplines and electives that pulled at the seams of every major civic ed movement in the history of American higher education, and these schools have the chance to rectify that. In my view, they will attain a lasting place, not only on their own campuses, but also in the landscape of American higher education by articulating and executing a distinctive intellectual mission that can be broadly appreciated as something new and needed. I'm very glad to see that a number of people at this conference are taking up this question, and I hope my paper will be taken as a contribution to that effort. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. I am mindful of one of the challenges of being pretty much the last speaker on the last panel of the day is all of you have endured quite a bit of vigorous and stimulating content all day, but the hour is getting late and I can understand some fatigue setting in, so I'll try not to put all of you to sleep. I'll congratulate you on your intrepid resilience and perseverance in making it through this long march on civics. I also do want to pay special tribute to our host today. I'm a native Arizonan, so it's a pleasure to be back in my home state. Grew up just down the highway in Tucson, and even though I haven't lived here since high school, all of my family is still here, and so it's a particular point of pride now that I'm honored with the stewardship of one of these new civic thought ventures at the University of Florida to come back and make a pilgrimage of sorts to the nativity of these efforts here in Arizona, my home state, and to pay tribute to the founding apostle Paul Carisse, and I guess we could say the Holy Trinity, including Will Hay as immediate successor and Rick the next one up. So anyway, divine blessings and divine obligations on all three of you. So don't break the covenant. There's always also some risk that a lot of very good things have been said already today. I'm going to try not to repeat them too much. I'm mindful of the line, everything may have been said, but not everyone's had a chance to say it yet, so here's mine. But I hope you'll hear some of my remarks building on, agreeing with, and in some ways maybe even emphasizing a couple of different themes or even disagreeing with in some cases some of the other things said earlier. And I'm going to start with a reflection on our present moment. The profound crisis of legitimacy and loss of public trust that American higher education is going through right now. And I'm originally a historian by training, so I always want to ask the contextual questions. How did we get here? What happened? And I think I won't go back as far back as Lee did to the 13th century, although I thought his 1,000-year, his millennial history of higher education was very stimulating. I largely agree with it. But do want to pick up with some of the seeds of kind of the immediate successors to Charles Eliot and the creation in the early 20th century of the modern American Research University. And I think we can look back now and see that when the modern American Research University was created in the 20s and 30s, and especially accelerated right after World War II with the GI Bill and the massive infusion of federal research money, there was an implicit social contract that was created between the American people and these new research universities being created. And when I say new research universities, some of these were the oldest ones in the country, the Ivy Leagues and some of the venerable publics such as University of North Carolina or University of Michigan. But as they transitioned from essentially undergraduate training places to now research universities. So what did this social contract look like? Well, the universities were given tremendous benefits, all right? So they were given tremendous economic benefits, tax preferences of being able to grow their endowments tax-free, right? Federal, billions and billions of dollars in federal research funding, and later supporting federal grants such as Pell Grants and others, so massive economic benefits. Universities were also given with the creation of the tenure system and its associated principles of academic freedom, tremendous legal and then even kind of social norm protections for the autonomy and the job security that goes with being a professor at a research university. Put it more bluntly, we can't be fired, right? On principles of academic freedom. And that's even a legal protection in many state laws. So that's a tremendous benefit. Universities were also given the credentialing power by the broader public that we generally care, do you have a college degree, and what's it in, and where did you get it from, right? That seems to mean something to us. It's rather intangible, it really means something to us. It can be a ticket to social prestige, to better jobs, and so many other things. Why do those things matter? Because we think they matter, right? And so those are all the benefits that the modern American Research University got from the American public. And in turn, what was the university's obligation to the American public? It was a number of things, but I'll just mention two of them. First was to use those federal resources and the academic freedom that comes with that to produce meaningful research of value, right? Whether it's in the STEM fields to produce, useful research in medicine for human health and engineering for efficiencies in our economy and other innovations. As well as in the liberal arts and humanities to produce research that was somehow advancing the true and the good and the beautiful, right? So the research part of the social contract for universities is produce research that somehow matters. And there was also a teaching part of the social contract, which was, and this gets very directly to our concern today, the citizenship question. Universities, in turn for the American public, giving them all this prestige, these resources, this cachet, and the freedom to teach what they want and research on what they want, universities were expected to be training students not just as subjects, not just as consumers and producers, but as citizens, to be inculcated with some sense of value, some sense of broader calling, some sense of gratitude and commitment to the broader good of the country and of the world. I think that's a pretty good social contract overall. I think it's one worth preserving. But here's the crisis. Universities have, by and large, completely abandoned their commitments. We could give it some exceptions, but universities are still getting all those benefits from the broader public, but they have not honored I should say we. I've been a part of universities for 14 years now, have not honored that commitment. Especially on the citizenship part. Rather, so many universities have seen their role as almost to be these prophetic outside voices undermining traditional American values, to use a cliched but I think still meaningful phrase, undermining the values of citizenship, training students rather to have a more oppositional and skeptical posture to the country and society that they live in. So as that has happened, for a while a lot of the rest of the country wasn't paying attention to it. Hopefully most of you here in the room were by your presence here. Certainly those of us who work in universities were seeing this and lamenting it. But of course, since October 7th, and the associated fallout, this broken social contract, I think, has been exposed more to the broader country. And now we're going through a bigger reckoning here. And this is the opportunity, I think, for our ventures. Just one example of how I think universities have moved away from that sense of their place in the United States as a country and in American society is the only real, this is a little bit silly, but I actually think it's also true, the only real American civic ritual that takes place on university campuses anymore, in any sort of broader collective sense, is singing the national anthem at football games. That's meaningful. I'm glad when we do it. That's the only time that happens anywhere. Now, it happens to be, in Texas or Florida, a gathering of 90 or 100,000 people, right? So that's meaningful. But 80-90% of the people at the game aren't part of the university anymore. It's, there's some students there, not many faculty there. It's alums, it's donors, it's local fans, right? And so thus the irony that the only time there is a broad American civic ritual at a university, it's being done by 90% of the people who aren't directly a part of the university anymore. A thought experiment, which again may sound a little cheeky, but when I tell you this and it sounds a little cheeky, ask yourself why. Why does this seem so absurd? What about if, as another meaningful American civic ritual, every university class, started the day with saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, right? It's done in elementary schools, maybe even some high schools. It doesn't happen in any universities, I don't think. Universities will do their other rituals. The Faculty Senate at the University of Texas, where I just finished teaching for 13 years, starts every Faculty Senate meeting with a reading of a land acknowledgement. It's a civic ritual of some meaning to the Faculty Senate anyway. But it would be absurd for them to think about actually starting the Faculty Senate meeting with a Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I'm not saying that should be mandated. I can think of different reasons. Pro and cons is a good idea, but ask ourselves, why does that seem like such an absurd, even impossibility? Right? And I think that'll show you the ethos that has crept into American universities of not seeing themselves as a part of that broader body politic. And so thus we come to the creation of these new schools of civic thought. At ASU SCETL, our hosts here today being the pioneers in this, the plank holders, if you will, but a number of other ventures, including the one that I'm just taking on the leadership of at the University of Florida. So again, thinking more recently, what are the different strains that go into the impulse behind the creation of these? It's no accident that they've all been done at public universities, which have some broader sense of accountability to the state political authorities and to the taxpaying citizens, whether through the governor's office, or the legislature, or the appointment of board of regents. So I think there's 6 different distinct yet interrelated trends that go into the creation of these schools, and then building on those trends, I'll kind of offer my 5 suggestions for how I think we can make the most of this moment. The first one, as has been talked by many others earlier, is the overall decline of social capital in the United States. This is somewhat distinct from the decline of civic knowledge, but just, it's going back to Bob Putnam's classic book from the 1990s, Bowling Alone, right? We just are not the Tocquevillian society forming voluntary associations that we once were. The loneliness epidemic is just the latest manifestation of that. And I think that has had some very negative consequences downstream for university life, and also has contributed to the second trend, which is the decline of civil discourse, the rise of polarization, and of tribalism. Again, Yuval gave some very eloquent remarks on this together, but we're really losing the capacity to reason together. And this is why one of the mandates of these new schools of civic thought, certainly an explicit one for those of us at the University of Florida, is to be teaching and training our students in civil discourse as well. The ability to disagree with each other in an agreeable fashion and still have some sense of common purpose. The third is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the decline of public trust in universities and academia overall, right? Most recent Gallup poll shows only 36% of the American public has high confidence in our universities, right? And that is a catastrophic, precipitous decline from just 5-6 years ago, when it was about 60%, and then 10 years ago it was about 80%. So this is a very recent trend. The decline is more among political conservatives, but we're seeing it among independents as well. And I can understand. I've been working at universities for 14 years. I don't trust universities either. I know this has been taped, but we're working on restoring the trust, right? Fourth is the decline in a number of academic fields and subfields. In my own discipline of history, this is the decline of political history, intellectual history, diplomatic history, military history, business history. We've also seen declines in political theory. We've seen declines in English literature, especially in the Elizabethan and Victorian era. So entire subfields of academic inquiry either being marginalized or completely devastated. Fifth is the decline of viewpoint diversity among university faculties. And this is, the proxy for this is usually political identification, voter registration, but that's just a proxy. I don't want to frame this in too much of a political way, but rather it's just a true that especially in the humanities, social sciences, and then let's say law and policy, university faculties have really become a political monoculture. And then the sixth one is the decline of professional opportunities for social science and humanities majors. All right, so all those strains lead into the creation of these new schools, and now the question is, what are we going to do about it, especially on this question of reinforcing civics? So I'll just observe 5 observations that are part of our theory of influence, our theory of the case here. The first one is that liberal arts and humanities can actually draw more students if they are properly taught, okay? We've, over the last 2-3 decades, we've seen a calamitous decline in a number of English majors and history majors across the country, but it's partly because the way the limited course offerings, the way they're being taught, are just not of much interest to students anymore. So one of the theories of the case that a number of us have is that if we actually teach these in more meaningful ways, and not just engaging teaching, but on meaningful subjects, that they can draw students. And even that some sort of common core, the required core course in Western civilization we're putting together at the University of Florida, can help provide a little bit more of a common college experience and form more of a collective civic identity there, right? Going back to this decline of social capital. If everyone is reading the same books and talking about the same things, meaningful friendships and associations can be formed. Second observation is I do think that we need to depoliticize these efforts. Politics are inescapable. I myself had even mentioned the concern about viewpoint diversity, but I think it's a mistake to try to make these schools explicitly conservative or to be seen as counter-programming or something like that. Rather, my appeal, or certainly our effort, is a return to a just more traditional apolitical or pre-political model of teaching in the classical liberal tradition. Third, I think with these efforts, we should treat civics as the ground floor, the foundation of these schools, but not the ceiling. And here's where, my appeal, I think, for our broader success within the university is going to be, again, civics is necessary but not sufficient for the broader success. I do think we need to be developing an even broader set of curriculum in the broader tradition of Western civilization. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. Fourth is, I think that we need to be teaching the history and values and civic principles of the United States in a way that creates a permission structure for patriotism. Patriotism, very appropriately, is in the title of our conference today. We haven't talked as much explicitly about patriotism from the stage. I hope we will more. But it's a way of letting the students know that it's okay to love your country. I find that most of my students at Texas, most of my students at Florida, they don't come in hating America, but they feel a little bit sheepish about, can we actually love this country, especially since they've been taught so much about our country's flaws. And so creating a permission structure that says it is okay to love your country, and you can love your country still in a reflective way, in that sense of reflective patriotism. We can talk in the discussion about what that might look like. And the final point is I'm seeing my glasses aren't so good. Does that say I have 10 minutes left? I just seeing if you're listening. Okay, 1 minute left. Okay, good, because it's my final point. It's also no accident that these new schools are being established at research universities, okay, in research public universities. We need to therefore develop a research agenda that goes along and advances and reinforces civic thought. And so far, again, going back to the beginning of my remarks, as these schools are part of research universities, while we have to have a very strong focus on undergraduate education, that's certainly what we're doing at University of Florida, we also need to engage and even revitalize the research mission of the university, of discovery, of pursuing, of producing new knowledge, of seeking after truth. That's certainly how we're trying to prioritize our faculty hiring, for example, at the University of Florida, of hiring promising or accomplished scholars, as well as devoted teachers. This would be important to build the legitimacy of these overall fields, to really be much more integrated within the university, advancing the research mission of the university. It's also a way to more directly engage with the broader public, producing insights in history and philosophy and political science and English that is of interest and use to the broader public. And then, of course, to training PhD students who will be the next generation of scholars once the founding generations of all of us have moved on. And so that, I think, that research agenda is going to be essential for creating civic thought as a viable academic field. Thank you very much.
Great. We have the floor is open to Q&A, and as seems to be the custom, I get the first question. All of the talks here suggested that one of the roles that we see incumbent on these new civic institutions is in some way inculcating a missing set of virtues. So some kind of civic virtues. I know Jenna used the language of intellectual virtues or reflective patriotism. Do any of you see an opportunity, a possibility, a need, and maybe some particular virtues that can be written into the curriculum of these new research centers?
Well, I was part of the way we're thinking about civic thought is what is the intellectual preparation that we can do to prepare people to exercise the virtue of prudence and political prudence in particular. So I think that's the one I've focused on most, but into the practice of that virtue would fall other virtues as well. May I respond for a moment to Lee's paper
Yeah, that'd
as
be
well?
great. Yeah, you
and
can ask the
maybe
question
leave
again,
people other time to think about that, because I hadn't expected this wonderful commentary on it. And Lee's question to our paper is are we trying to articulate a master discipline by talking about civic thought? And I think in a certain way, yes, and in a certain way, it wasn't necessarily the intention, although I'm very curious to explore the implications he sees in it further. Civic thought is a way to get disciplines to converse, in our view. I've noticed that at most colleges and universities, there's a kind of interdisciplinary urge, right? We all want to get together and read Machiavelli, but then it doesn't amount to much in many cases. And I think that's often because we don't really know how to do it or even why we're doing it. There's no organizing principle to the interdisciplinary work. In the paper that we had written, we had noted that Robert Maynard Hutchins, president of the University of Chicago from long ago, an institution that we were also trained in, said that in order to recover this kind of interdisciplinarity, we need to recognize a common metaphysical system. He called it a metaphysical queen of the sciences because we couldn't have a theological queen of the sciences any longer. And in the paper, we suggested that this may not be appropriate for our society and our politics, but there could be a different organizing principle that's suitable to citizens of a democratic republic, drawing on the ideas of Jeremy Waldron or of Yuval, the way he put it this morning. We don't need to think alike, but we do need to act together. So the question there is there any way, how can we provide a better intellectual formation for the task of acting together, which we all need to do? And that gets me to the question of how to cultivate the virtue of political prudence. What's the appropriate way in which universities and academic training can help people prepare for the exercise of that virtue? And to do that, I think we need not only the development of specialists, but also the development of a distinctive kind of mind, which is a disciplined generalist. Yeah.
I'd just say a couple things in response to Rick's question, and it maybe follows up a little bit of what Jenna had said as well. So in Jenna's remarks and then in hers and Ben's paper, my perception is that a lot of the discussion about the virtues that citizens would need, and I think you even articulated orally here, would be focused on the relationship of the citizen to, politics is too narrow, but maybe the political regime, which would include law, among other things. And I guess my thought would be that I don't see the reason, maybe you're not saying that this wouldn't be the case. I don't see the reason why the suite of virtues that one would need to be a free citizen wouldn't also be applicable. So thinking, for example, of justice's lawfulness, the disposition to follow the law, civic friendship, so willing the good of all of our fellow citizens. A person could, in a civic thought program, have knowledge about that, of course. There'd have to be additional ways to cultivate that. So it seems like the whole suite of virtues should be available. Is that your view too, Jenna?
Can I offer a couple of thoughts on this? So, I think the first observation is I'm finding, Ben Sass and I are co-teaching a class, a freshman honors seminar at Florida this semester. It's my first class teaching there since I'm newly arrived, on the American idea. But in treating the United States, our country, as an idea, we're trying to also profile notable individuals in the American past. Some of them quite well known, some founding fathers, others a little bit less known. But it's partly because we've found that, and I saw this with my students at Texas too, this generation of young people, like all of us, I suppose, they want heroes, they want exemplars, but they've come of age in an era of cynicism, of atomization, certainly without a whole lot of inspiring or ennobling role models or heroes. And one reason why, by trying to focus on notable individuals in the American past, all of whom, of course, are imperfect, and we don't hide from the imperfections, but it's not just a pedagogical device to show how ideas are developed by people, but also, like, there's, our country was built and has been sustained by some really remarkable people, and ones who I do think are worthy of some adulation and emulation. Related to this, and we haven't done this yet at Florida, but did it every year at Texas, and I'm hoping to continue at Florida, and this is not fully scalable, but I find that study abroad experiences, especially when wrapped around a meaningful curriculum, can really help in cultivating values in students in ways that just teaching in the classroom wouldn't. And so here's an example I'll use. Is for the last decade at Texas, every May, I and a couple of my colleagues would take 20 of our undergraduates over to Europe, primarily to do a term of study in London on the history of the Anglo-American relationship. But we'd also include a few days at Normandy, right, taking them over to the Normandy beaches for our World War II unit. And, we would have taught them the background on this and, the geopolitical significance of World War II and the American entry. But then we'll just take them to the American cemetery at Omaha Beach. We'll have them do the flag raising ceremony in the morning or flag lowering ceremony in the evening. And they'll see that the 10,000 graves there of the American, soldiers at Omaha Beach, almost all of whom are the same age as our students when they were killed, 18, 19, 20 years old. And it gives them a very different sense of their country's history than they may have gotten in previous classes they've taken or in high school. And we don't have to be pedantic about it. We just show them, this is what your forebears did for the cause of freedom. And then I'll read them, that, I think, wonderful Colin Powell quote, like Colin Powell when he was encountering a spate of European anti-Americanism and accusations of America as just another rapacious imperial power. And he said, of the previous generation, he said, over 300,000 Americans gave their lives to free Europe from tyranny, and the only land we asked for was land to bury our dead. And we'll show them that as we're walking through the cemetery. And that's a very powerful history lesson, but it's also a very powerful civics lesson. It's a powerful way, I think, of cultivating these virtues among our students by showing them rather than telling them. And like I said, creating that permission structure for them to feel some sense of love and obligation to their country, and find some heroes, including heroes whose names they never would have heard of before, who didn't leave a memoir, who don't have entire classes on them, but ones who lie beneath the sand of Omaha Beach.
Thank you. I think we have talked about this earlier today, a sense of gratitude.
Yeah, gratitude, yeah.
Thank you to all of the panelists. I want to touch on a point that Professor Inboden brought up and maybe ask all of you on the panel to address it. The issue of depoliticizing these efforts, I think, is a really challenging task, especially because legislatures are starting some of these. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about strategies for doing so, because some of us truly do believe this is a nonpartisan project. Saying, do you think fewer students need to read the Constitution is a pretty basic observation that I think would be hard to deny. So I'll throw that out there. Anyone who wants to comment on it?
So the experience in Ohio was an experience that was relatively politicized for what it was worth. I think there are a lot of unfortunate reasons for that. One of them was that the experience, that the legislation creating the 5 different centers in Ohio was occurring simultaneously with what I would colloquially call anti-DEI legislation. People perceived those as being from the same source. They actually have different genealogies, but they, for a variety of reasons, arose in the legislature at the same time. So there was a lot of politicization. So I think, at least for the centers in Ohio, there's been a lot of work that has been done and has to be done in order to achieve the goal of what I think is generally true and generally good, that these are healthy for all Americans of all different viewpoints. And I'll just talk about some of the things that I've done personally. So one of them is to be very intentional about making sure that the public-facing activities, and behind the scenes as well, but especially the public-facing activities, are inclusive of people of all viewpoints. And for what it's worth, it's not hard in an existing university to find people who have different viewpoints, right? At least different viewpoints than for example, myself. And so just by having people who are affiliated with our center or our institute, offering classes, hosting programming, commenting on programming, engaging in research and scholarship, and supporting that, by definition, that's people of a wide variety of viewpoints. Second, the public-facing programming has been intentionally focused on 2 aspects. So one aspect is things that Americans of all viewpoints are interested in and passionate about, and then making sure that more than one perspective is brought forward on whatever those different topics are. Third, making sure to cultivate through honestly just a lot of meetings, a lot of lunches, a lot of coffees, getting a chance to talk with people who, again, by definition, typically have different viewpoints, about what are the ways in which we can partner with you. What is it that you would like to do that you're currently not able to do that fits within the mission of this center, and then going to support that. So it has been a challenge, and I think that what I've seen personally, and I think other people have seen as well, is that once you show that what you're doing, in fact, is something that people of a wide variety of viewpoints can and should embrace, then whatever the negativity is starts to reduce.
No.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's the issue, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. So bipartisan or multi-partisan means you have, people who have open, explicit partisan affiliations. You just have a range of them, diversity of them. So nonpartisan means you're just kind of staying away from the explicit political identifications. And Jenna, you may have some thoughts on this too, but I'll echo and strongly affirm everything Lee said. I think there's a lot of wisdom there. A few additional reflections on how we are trying to navigate this at the University of Florida, because yes, there was a series of political acts, including the passage of legislation by the Florida legislature that created the Hamilton Center. So in that sense, the political roots of our nativity are inescapable. But if you read the actual law, like the text of the law that gives us our charter, it's pretty straightforward. It says that the Hamilton Center will be hiring faculty and creating a curriculum and offering courses and majors in things related to Western civilization, great books, and the American founding, and with a certain pedagogical mission of encouraging civil discourse and the virtues of citizenship. I don't see that as political or partisan at all. That's a mission, a mandate I can certainly affirm, and I would think and hope almost all Americans, and certainly all of my, most of my fellow faculty colleagues could affirm it as well. In practice, so in the last 5 months, I have interviewed 40 faculty finalists on campus. People come out for auditioning for our faculty positions. I have not asked a single one how you vote. Right? I don't look up their voting registration. They can all tell you this. Right? And so some of it is just making clear in practice. What do I talk to them about? Their scholarship, their teaching, their general commitment to this overall academic mission. Now, I also say, and I mean this, that unlike most academic units across higher education, we at the Hamilton Center don't regard being a conservative as disqualifying. And unfortunately, that is the case. I've lived it. A lot of others can tell horror stories here. For decades, there has been very explicit, overt discrimination against identifiable conservatives in academic hiring. We're not doing that. And so there might be more people who identify as conservative who end up on our faculty. But it's not because of an explicit political agenda. And then finally, especially, we try to be very clear with our students. We're keeping politics out of the classroom. We have students of a broad range of political affiliations in our classes. I've been it's a matter of public record. You can look it up. I am a Republican, but I've been doing a lot to try to get some of my progressive Democratic students good internships in D.C. this summer with politicians who I probably wouldn't vote for. But my mission is not to try to indoctrinate them. My mission is to support and encourage their education and their professional development. And so those are some practical steps I think we can be taking to depoliticize these broader efforts.
Yeah, I agree with most of what's been said here. I do think, just to respond directly to Liz's question, that trying to say that these efforts are just nonpartisan from the beginning, it doesn't strike people as honest, right? Because they are happening in red states and they are happening by Republican-led legislation anyway. But I think that's something we can acknowledge without saying that the education is going to be partisan or productive of conservatives or something like this. I think the better way to think about it is that, look, in this case, one party saw more clearly what was needed for the kind of next wave of civic education in the universities and was most mobilized to act on that in a very energetic way. They're not the only people that see that service learning is inadequate. I named others at the beginning of this talk that see this, but working through the kinds of channels of the universities that they're doing, it just takes a lot more time, right? So I think it's just the case, as Plato said, when two go together, one sees before the other, right? Republicans are out on the lead on this, but that doesn't mean that it's not actually for everybody and for the public good. And I certainly think that is the case, and that has to be made clear in the way that you two mentioned. But I think I would also call it an education that is pre-partisan. That's a word that Justin Dyer uses in the sense that it's a general, it's a preparation, a general preparation for citizenship. I think I would use bipartisan as well, if what is meant by that is what Will was indicating, that you are open to including and maybe even looking to include people that investigate questions that conservatives tend to care about. For example, if it's originalism, what is this? Is it a valid mode of interpretation? Those kinds of questions, I've been told, are very hard to ask in law schools. And I think faculties, when they're hiring, should be asking themselves, well, why do I think this is off the table? This is a really important phenomenon in the legal field in American life. And shouldn't we have somebody, among the many things we consider when we're hiring somebody, should we rather than exclude those people, should we think, oh, maybe that should be represented here in some way?
Thank you. I would love to hear all of your thoughts on the relationship between what I see as two missions or parts of a mission of these schools of civic thought. One, it seems to me, is to provide a deeply formative education for citizenship and leadership for a relatively small subset of the student population at a large public university like where we are today at Arizona State. A second mission seems to be to provide something else, some other form of civic education, some much smaller dose of civic education that reaches as many students on campus as possible. Maybe, and that may just mean one course or programming that doesn't even amount to a course for credit. So given inevitably limited resources, even as these programs have more resources than they used to have, given the limits of those resources, what do you think is the proper balance between these two missions? Deeply formative education for a relatively small subset of students versus a much less impactful education for as many students as possible. And then I guess a related question would be, what do you see as the main goals of that education intended for as many students as possible, even if it's just coming in the form of a single course or even less than a single 3-credit course?
You want to go first?
Sure. I think that's a great question. My initial thought is maybe threefold. First, I think it depends on the institution and what the resources are, the opportunities and challenges presented by a particular institution as to which of the two routes that you identified you pursue more rather than the other. Second, I would say it doesn't seem like in principle you can't pursue both routes. I would say our tentative goal is to pursue both routes, and we try to do that through a variety of mechanisms. So one mechanism is through a student fellowship program, which provides a small cohort that we want to live in, be part of an academic community that is both thoughtful and character forming, but also have other courses and other programming that is broader and that gives people a taste of the value that we think that our institute is providing. So it can be public events, it can be a large class that a student might take just at one point. Third thing is actually, and maybe different universities are different, I don't think that's the case, but actually many of the large classes are actually revenue generators, so to the extent that you're in need of revenue, then having large classes being taught to a lot of students is a way to actually support the more focused activities that you identified. So I actually think there might be a synergy between those two routes.
Yeah, again, largely agreeing with what Lee said, and we're in a similar situation at University of Florida, where we have a mandate. The state has put in a new graduation requirement for one course for all undergraduates, and we have about 40,000 undergraduates right now. It goes live in another year on civil discourse, right? Principal. And the Hamilton Center will be the lead on that. So we'll be reaching several thousand students a year with that one. I'll say this, I have we're still developing that course or the series of modules that will qualify for that course, and I have a couple hopes for it. One, that it will be an appealing front porch, if you will, for the other courses and eventually the majors and degrees that we're offering. But two, those of us who are older here and graduated from college a long time ago, by the time you get to my age, I loved my undergraduate experience, but there's really only 3 or 4 classes I can actually remember, right? I took a lot more than 3 or 4. My goal is that 20 or 30 years from now, that Hamilton course in civil discourse will be one of the 2 or 3 that Florida students remember, right? One of those transformative ones. But then on the second part, we are we're trying to develop 5 new majors, all of them multidisciplinary, all of them built around these a common core in Western civilization, but all of them that'll be providing our students knowledge, skills, and values, and be connected to a viable professional track. I just mentioned this in passing about the jobs crisis for liberal arts and humanities majors, and we want to be able to help answer that. And so it will be more than just in 4 years of enrichment on the values of citizenship. It'll what we hope will be giving them that, but also preparing them to be good job candidates for investment banking or private equity or venture capital or the intelligence community or teaching in classical schools, any number of viable professional tracks too.
Just a brief comment on that, but I think Lee's right to say that there can be a synergy between these two things. And I think about this from one end. If civic thought is developed as a discipline, and particularly if it develops the research agenda that Will spoke about, if it is recognized as something that is a kind of high intellectual ambition, something dignified, something exciting to engage in, I think it's more likely that it will not only be required, but embraced by people as a first-year course or something like this. Paul Carisse wrote an article a while ago that said civics is often looked at as the equivalent of dentistry, like a dental checkup. You have to do it, it's your duty, but it's not seen as something that's actually worthy of the highest activity of the mind. And he was making a case there that it should be. It should be something that we really delight in doing. And I think one way to do that is to show that you can do high-level research in this emerging field.
My question, it is inspired by Dr. Inboden's statement on the fact that public trust in universities and academia is at a low. So I'm wondering, and this question is open to anybody on the panel, what does the pathway look like towards gaining the public's trust in academia and universities?
Well, I guess I should take that up since I'm the one who lobbed that hand grenade out there, right? It's going to be, I think, a long, hard path, right? I mean, and it's going to start with universities, university leaders, feel like this is the first of the 12-step program. Admit you've got a problem, okay? And up until a few months ago, most universities still weren't acknowledging that. Universities can be remarkably self-contained bubbles, but there's been a real shock to the system. So I think admitting we've got a problem, and then the loss of public trust. This is not just a political question, right? This gets to things like runaway administrative bloat. It gets to things like runaway tuition costs, far outpacing the cost of inflation, the student debt crisis. Again, these are policy concerns, but they're not really political ones. I don't care who you vote for. You're not going to like that it's now $70,000 a year for tuition at a private university, most elite privates. But part of the loss of public trust also comes to this growing sense of the American public, again, which they are not wrong to think that we stand for a broad certain set of values and a certain sense of commitment to our country, and it feels like not only most universities, the faculty, the leadership don't share those, but they're actually working against those, right? And that's why my broader appeal, and even my, admittedly somewhat cheeky example about the Pledge of Allegiance, and why, it's inconceivable that universities would even say that. And so the answer is not to do the Pledge of Allegiance at universities, but to actually to do a much deeper reckoning of what do we stand for? What are the values we're trying to cultivate in our students? And universities are not value neutral. They've been trying to cultivate values. It's a very different set of values over the last few decades, returning those. And even tangible things, and this has been, there's been some favorable trends here. Over the last decade or so, universities inviting ROTC units back on campus, other U.S. government, CIA recruiters back on campus. For several decades after Vietnam, they'd been banned from campus. And so some of those proactive steps is saying that, yes, we still see our mission of academic freedom and speaking truth to power and so on and so forth, but we also are mindful of that we are benefits from the resources and the political system and the public support of the American government, American people, and we have some sense of obligation to that.
I agree with everything that Will had said. I would maybe think of it in two different buckets, right? So one bucket is that universities need to display that they're open to Americans of all viewpoints. So Ohio is a red, purplish state, and echoing what Will had said, many people don't perceive public universities as being open to them, their viewpoints, their worldviews, and affirmatively undermining it. Second, I would say, and this is Will's point as well, the value proposition, so reestablishing that, and I appreciate Will's point especially about having the different tracks that they're talking about. I think there's like a related point too, so the value proposition is of course economic, but it's also, I'm in many cases paying for my child to spend 4 years at this institution. Will that child be enhanced to be the man or woman that I want them to be, or will they be taken on a different path to be somewhere else? And I also think there's even a related part of the value proposition, which is, are there aspects where the larger community views itself as being benefited? So just to give one example, we held a debate between the two leading scholars on the legal issue of whether Donald Trump is eligible for office. And we did it at night, and we had hundreds of people, just average Americans, coming. And I was worried because it's an issue about which people, of course, are very passionate. But people were civil, people were passionate but civil, and I would say everybody went away enriched intellectually, and also just the experience of, Will had mentioned pledges of allegiance, and this wasn't quite that warm and fuzzy, but it was, I'm here with my fellow citizens with whom I know I disagree, and I'm leaving in civic friendship with my fellow citizens.
Thank you.
I guess I have one very small comment to all these things that have been said. I think how universities can regain public trust, the first step being to admit that the relationship has been broken. I think that the political pressure that's being put on universities now is causing them to do that, quite obviously, but also causing some people in the universities who have thought that some of these things were a problem, but never really saw the opportunity or to raise those because there was no incentive to doing so, now see that there actually is an incentive to raise those. So I think we will actually see more faculty, more administrators agreeing with the fact that universities have broken this public trust and that they need to do several things to restore it.
Thank you.
I love this idea in civil society that we need to move together, but maybe we might disagree on a few things. I think it's made more challenging by this idea that we might be in a post-truth era. So I'd love for you to maybe talk about how these programs might deal with media literacy and how we kind of might need to teach our students how to deal with people who are coming to the table with different facts, and how we need to approach that in our society.
I think that's a great question about the media literacy. It was brought up earlier as well, and I took a note for future investigation. The one thing I would say that we're doing that I think indirectly or maybe even some ways directly addresses your point is, so there are two classes that we're planning to offer next academic year. Both of them involve issues about which Americans are passionate: global warming, gun control, right to life, et cetera. The students are going to be engaged with leading scholarship on different perspectives on each of those issues. The students are going to be writing those papers, presenting those papers to each other. And so it's a way to kind of curate the information that they're receiving. So there's a faculty member who is being the filter for the most powerful arguments on respective sides. And then also the students are coming in and being exposed to those arguments, but also fellow citizens who have different views on that. And they're working through, and in doing so, seeing their fellow citizens, even though they disagree, as civic friends. So it doesn't address the media part, but it does address the part that the students are going to learn what are some of the mechanisms where I can become more informed, both about the position that I currently hold and alternative positions that are out there. What are the sources where I can find reliable information?
Just a couple of thoughts I'll add on that. And again, I do not have the answer to this problem. It's a very big one, so I can sit here and admire the problem with you. But I find one reason why I enjoy teaching historical case studies on past political or policy controversies is it's a way to get the students to try to mentally inhabit the world of debates, 19th century debates over slavery and secession, 20th century debates over intervention or not in World War I. Very emotionally fraught, very charged, consequential issues, but ones that are largely in the past. And having the students read what different proponents on all sides are saying, it's a way to get them to think more critically about hearing different viewpoints and looking at how an issue is argued without feeling too personally invested in it the way that we might if it's a contemporary debate today. But the others is oftentimes I'll start a class off with just a 10-15 minute sort of contemporary issues discussion, especially if it relates to the historical material we're doing. And, just tell the students, we're not going to solve this one, but I just want to, I want to hear a range of viewpoints on this. This is a, safe place for you to talk about that, right? We'll treat each other with civility. But over the course of that, it's not just what do you think of this issue, but where are you getting your information, right? What are your sources of authority? What do you regard as authoritative on this? And getting them to interrogate those a little bit more, or at least hear from others in the class who may be getting it from elsewhere. So it doesn't solve everything, but at least lifts them momentarily out of their immediate social media, self-contained universe.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'd say is professors should be careful not to cater to the literary level, I suppose, that students are coming in with, where they prefer to get their news or information. It's very hard as a professor to take them from there to something that's more difficult to read but more challenging, and then there's always a temptation to kind of meet them where they are. But you just have to find new ways of kind of scaffolding
Plato
them up.
doesn't have an Instagram account. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, actually, he probably does somewhere, but yeah. Okay.
I was wondering within your programs how you plan to or how you handle ideologies relating to the role of the citizen, the responsibilities of the citizen, and the relationship between citizen and state that emanate from the left, and particularly the hard left. Is this something that you let to the other parts of the university that may have more of a predilection for that kind of stuff, or do you bring that into your curricula as well?
Go ahead, Lee.
It's something that I'm intentionally trying to identify faculty who, and I have been able to do so, who both share the perspective that you identified, are articulate from that perspective, but also are fair to other perspectives and have a facility with bringing that perspective in conversation with other perspectives in the classroom in a way that's welcoming to all viewpoints. So it's something that I'm intentionally trying to do. It was kind of in response to the previous question, where it's a way for students to see that you can have people of a variety of viewpoints who have sound reasons for those different viewpoints and are able to understand each other better even if they continue to disagree. So I think that's essential. It goes back to one of the earlier questions that we had as well about how do you establish that these centers in institutes are actually valuable to Americans of a variety of viewpoints. One is to make sure that viewpoints that people have are represented in the classrooms and elsewhere in programming as well.
Yeah, I would, again, I feel like I'm just the amen chorus for Lee Strang here, but I'll tell you what a great job I think he's doing. We're in the process of hiring a scholar of communism at Hamilton Center. I don't think he's a communist. I didn't ask him, but I know he just does really good historical and theoretical work on communism, and our students need to understand that, right? I mean, it was one of the most consequential, I would argue, destructive ideology of the 20th century. It still has many adherents. It's had a number of spin-offs. So, yeah, we'll absolutely teach about those. But he is, as far as I can tell, he's not a proponent of communism. And even if he is a proponent of communism, he won't be doing that in our classroom. So it's about, teaching the students to understand and even read critically from a range of backgrounds and viewpoints. So rather than an indoctrination session.